So, Leah, how are you? That's a very nice name. Now, when you were talking to me on the phone, I could see your present life and I could see the future also. And I saw some of your past lives, and they were very interesting. So, let's talk about your present life now. Now you have a very good friend, and he's a gay man named David. And this is no surprise because the two of you had 7 previous lives where you knew each other. Now, I know that you are in your 20s and you are anxious to start a family. And you told David that you wanted to have his baby. And he declined. Well, that's just fine because I see you meeting a man in about 2 years. And you marry him and you have 3 children. So, now that I put your mind at ease, let's look at some of your past lives. So, the first life that I want to discuss is a little over 2,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. And you were a woman, and you were a female servant of Cleopatra. Now, most people think that Cleopatra was a raving beauty, but that's not the case. But she was very intelligent, and she was charming, and she spoke 6 languages, and that's what men were attracted to. And Cleopatra was very nice to her servants, and the servants loved her and she loved them. Cleopatra also had male servants which would handle the heavier work, such as carrying her on a litter. So, anyway, you were very good friends with one of the male servants, and his name was Ahmet. And since the 2 of you were servants, you didn't have very much spare time. But in your spare moments, you would talk to him and you became very close friends. And you would discuss things that friends do, such as the nuances of life and your hopes and dreams. So even servants had hopes and dreams. But unfortunately, when you were 23, you contracted malaria, and there was no treatment, of course, way back then. And so you died, and Ahmet, your best friend, was quite upset, and so was Cleopatra, because you were basically her favorite female servant. And Cleopatra gave you an elaborate funeral ceremony, or I should say burial ceremony. And they mummified your body, which is a very complicated process which takes about 70 days, and I'm not going to go into the details. But the end result was you were laid to rest in a beautiful sarcophagus that was decorated with solid gold embellishments, and you were laid in a tomb that was fit for royalty. And as it turns out, around 1915, archaeologists discovered your sarcophagus, and they were baffled as to who you were, but since it was so elaborate and exquisite, they assumed that you were a member of royalty. And your sarcophagus and mummy are on display in a British museum today, and it's labeled Unknown Egyptian Princess. But you weren't a princess, you were a servant. And that will be our little secret. So, let's move on and explore another life that you had 700 years ago in the Calabria region of Italy, and you were a man. Now, there weren't many choices of careers for men 700 years ago in Italy, and you were not interested in an agricultural type of career, so you gravitated toward a religious vocation and you decided to be a monk. Now, being a monk would have been a rather monotonous life, but you shared a room with a man named Vincenzo, which in English would be Vincent. And you lived in a monastery that was a large stone building, and it was 4 stories high, and it was surrounded by a moat. And you and Vincent became very, very close friends. And if it weren't for him, life as a monk would certainly be a rather dreary existence. So, he was about 10 years older than you, and he was actually an older soul than you, and you learned a lot from him. And he taught you how to cultivate a garden of medicinal plants and herbs. And he was also very poetic. For instance, he would look at the stars with you and tell you that stars were placed in the sky for men to gaze upon and dream and aspire to reach for the heavens. And you were basically enthralled with him, and you were very close. But tragically, one day there was a terrible fire at the monastery. And since the interior of the monastery was constructed mainly of wood, the fire spread quickly. And you and Vincent were trapped in your room, and the flames of the fire were lapping at the door, and you could feel the heat of the fire beneath the wooden floor at your feet. And Vincent knew that the only escape was to jump out the window. So he stood behind you and urged you to jump, but you were petrified because the window was 30 feet from the moat below, and you were afraid of being injured, and plus you didn't know how to swim and you didn't know how deep the moat was. And the floor began to burn, so Vincent pushed you out the window. And unfortunately, at that same moment, the floor collapsed and Vincent perished in the fire. But meanwhile, you landed safely in the moat below, and the water helped to cushion your fall, and it was only 5 feet deep. So you crawled out of the water, and you were alive and well, but shaken up, and you began to sob uncontrollably because you knew your friend was gone, and you were overcome with grief. Well, you continued on as a monk and lived in another monastery, and you made a few friends and led a rather quiet life, but you never quite recovered from losing your dear friend. And I dare say you were in love with him, but there was no romance going on between the two of you. It was very strictly platonic relationship. So you ended up dying at the ripe old age of 70. So now I would like to discuss another life where you were also a man. And it's the most recent life before the life you are living right now. And it was in the 1880s in Bulgaria. So let's look at you as a teenage boy, age 14. You had blonde hair and blue eyes, and you were leading up to that point a rather dismal life. You were one of the servants of King Ferdinand of Bulgaria. Now, King Ferdinand became very fond of you, and one day he took advantage of you, if you know what I mean. And the king's wife and some individuals in the royal household knew what he was doing to you, but nobody said anything. Because basically, nobody questions what a king is doing. And if you look at history, we know that members of royalty and government officials will often have bad behavior, let's say, and commit unspeakable crimes and even murder, and they get away with it. So nobody said anything, and his activities with you continued for some time, and it was killing you emotionally. Even though he was never violent and he did not hit you, it was against your will. And it was wrong. So one day, you devised a scheme that would put you out of your misery, and you hid a knife in your clothing, and you were planning to stab him the next time that the king laid his hands on you. But at the last instant, you had a change of heart and you just could not do it. So you realized that you had to run away, knowing that you would probably have a life of extreme poverty. Eventually you did escape, and it was actually a good decision because you met a wonderful young woman and you married her and you had 2 children. And you confided in her what happened with the king, and she sympathized with you and supported you. And with time, the scars of those episodes in your life gradually faded away. And you ended up having a relatively happy life, even though you were very poor. And so, now, I know it's a lot of stunning information that I've provided to you, and your mind is probably spinning. But I want to explain to you how these lives relate to your present life. Now, your friend Ahmet from the life in Egypt 2,000 years ago is now your friend David. And your future husband, whom you have not met yet, well, he was Vincent, the man who saved you from that horrible fire 700 years ago in Italy. And your firstborn child will be a boy, and he was that young woman that you married in Bulgaria in the 1880s. So now you see that your life is good now, but it's going to get even better. And that is the wonderful circle of life.